Welcome to the podcast. I'm David Jolly, and today we explore the tipsy side of American history and the night the Founding Fathers apparently spent the modern equivalent of $17,000 on drinks at Philadelphia's City Tavern. This is the story about 55 delegates who celebrated the completion of the Constitution with enough alcohol to float a small boat, and what their legendary drinking session tells us about how America was, really born. Let's head back to September 15th, 1787, and after 4 grueling months of debates, arguments, and compromises, the Constitutional Convention is finally wrapping up. The delegates have just put the finishing touches on a document that will govern our country for centuries to come. They're exhausted, they're relieved, and they're ready to party, so they head out to the most famous tavern in Philadelphia, the City Tavern, for what might be the most expensive celebration in American political history. The receipt for that legendary night has survived to this day, and it reads like something from a bachelor party gone completely off the rails. Here it is. The 55 delegates consumed 54 bottles of Madeira wine, 60 bottles of claret, 8 bottles of whiskey, 22 bottles of porter, 8 bottles of hard cider, 12 bottles of beer, and 7 large bowls of alcoholic punch. And that's just what we know about. There might even be more than that. So let's put this into perspective. We're talking about roughly 2 bottles of wine per person, plus whiskey, beer, cider, and punch. In today's money, accounting for inflation and the relative cost of imported wines, this tab would run somewhere between $15,000 and $20,000. That's not really a celebration. That's a full-scale alcoholic assault on sobriety. But here's the thing about 18th century America. This kind of drinking wasn't considered necessarily unusual or excessive. It was Tuesday. The average American in 1787 consumed about 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year, roughly 3 times what the average American at least, drinks today. Water was also unsafe to drink, so people turned to beer, wine, and spirits as safer alternatives. Morning toddies, afternoon wine, and evening punch were as normal as morning coffee is to us today. The City Tavern wasn't just any old bar either. It was essentially the unofficial headquarters of American politics. Located just 2 blocks from Independence Hall, it served as a meeting place, dining room, and networking center for the political elite. If you wanted to get anything done in Philadelphia politics, you did it at the City Tavern over a few drinks or more. The tavern's owner, Daniel Smith, knew how to cater to important customers. The City Tavern offered the finest imported wines, the smoothest whiskeys, and the most sophisticated atmosphere in Philadelphia. It was where foreign diplomats came to gather intelligence, where congressmen made backroom deals, and where the future of America was often decided over dinner and drinks. So when the Constitutional Convention delegates decided to celebrate there, they weren't just having a party, they were participating in a grand political tradition. The toasts that night weren't just to their own success, but to the complicated, messy, alcohol-fueled process that had created American democracy. But let's talk about what they were actually drinking, because this wasn't just a bunch of guys pounding beer. The 54 bottles of Madeira tells us a lot about the sophistication of this crowd. Madeira was the wine of choice for American gentlemen. It was imported from Portuguese islands, aged perfectly during the long sea voyage, and cost a fortune. George Washington was particularly addicted to the stuff, and Thomas Jefferson considered it essential for civilized dining. The 60 bottles of claret, basically Bordeaux wine, were equally expensive and refined. This wasn't just cheap colonial wine. This was the good stuff, imported from France at considerable expense. The fact that they ordered more claret than Madeira suggests the delegates wanted to make a serious statement about the importance of their celebration. The whiskey, on the other hand, was American-made, possibly even from Pennsylvania. This was the people's drink, the affordable spirit that ordinary Americans relied on for everything from medicine to mood enhancement. By including whiskey alongside the fancy wines, the delegates were symbolically bridging the gap between the elite and popular culture. And those 7 bowls of punch? Well, punch was the party drink of the 18th century, made with rum, fruit juices, spices, and whatever else was handy. Punch was designed for communal drinking. You gathered around the punch bowl. You told stories, you made toasts, and you bonded over shared cups. It was liquid democracy in action. And here's where the story gets really interesting. This wasn't just a random party. The timing suggests that this epic drinking session was actually a carefully orchestrated political event. September 15th was just 2 days before the convention's official conclusion, which means the delegates were essentially celebrating the completion of their work while the Constitution was still being finished. Think about what was happening in those final days. The delegates knew that they had created something unprecedented, a new form of government that balanced federal and state power, created 3 separate branches, and established a system of checks and balances. But they also knew that selling this Constitution to the American people would be an enormous challenge. The celebration at City Tavern served multiple purposes. First, it allowed the delegates to decompress after months of intense political pressure. Second, it created a bonding experience that would help them present a united front during the upcoming ratification debates. And third, it sent a message to Philadelphia's political community that the convention had been successful and that important people were confident about the result. The guest list for this party reads like a who's who of American politics. George Washington was there, of course, along with Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and most of the other major figures from the convention. But the party also included delegates who had opposed each other fiercely during the debates. Luther Martin, who had walked out of the convention in protest, apparently came back for the drinks. This mixing of political opponents was probably intentional. In the 18th century, political culture, sharing drinks, was the way of signaling that political disagreements were just business, not personal. By drinking together, the delegates were demonstrating that despite their fierce debates over the Constitution, they remained part of the same political community. The alcohol probably helped with this reconciliation process. As anyone who's ever been to a work happy hour knows, a few drinks can smooth over professional tensions and remind people of their common interests. Delegates who'd been screaming at each other over representation and federal power could bond over shared appreciation for good wine and funny stories. But here's the darker side of this story. The $17,000 bar tab represents a level of luxury and expense that was completely out of reach for ordinary Americans. While the delegates were sipping imported Madeira and toasting their political success, most Americans were struggling with economic hardship, debt, and uncertainty about the future. The economic divide was actually one of the major issues the Constitution was designed to address. The delegates believed that stronger federal government could promote economic stability and prosperity. But the opulent celebration at City Tavern highlighted the gap between the political elite, who would govern under the new Constitution, and the ordinary citizens who would live under it. The alcohol choices also reflected the complex international relationships that the new Constitution would have to navigate. The Madeira came from Portuguese colonies. The claret came from France. The punch was made with Caribbean rum. Every drink represented a different trading relationship, a different diplomatic challenge, and a different aspect of America's emerging role in the global economy. French wine was particularly significant, since France had been America's crucial ally during the Revolutionary War. By serving claret at their celebration, the delegates were symbolically toasting the international relationships that had made American independence possible. But they were also acknowledging that managing those relationships would be one of the government's biggest challenges. The whiskey, as the only definitive American product on the menu, represented the domestic economy that the Constitution was supposed to strengthen. The fact that American whiskey could share the table with Portuguese Madeira and French claret suggested that the new nation was ready to compete on equal terms with established European powers. The sheer scale of the drinking also tells us something about 18th century attitudes towards alcohol and decision-making. These were not teetotalers who believed that important decisions required complete sobriety. They were men who conducted business over drinks, made deals in taverns, and saw alcohol as a social lubricant that facilitated rather than hindered good judgment. This perspective might seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but it was perfectly normal for the time. The idea that alcohol impaired judgment was less common in an era when most people were slightly buzzed most of the time. The delegates probably felt that moderate drinking actually improved their decision-making by reducing anxiety and encouraging honest communication. The location of this celebration was also symbolically important. By choosing the City Tavern instead of a private home or government building, the delegates were emphasizing the public nature of their achievement. The Constitution belonged not just to them, but to the broader community of citizens who gathered in places like taverns to discuss politics and current events. The aftermath of this legendary drinking session is also worth considering. The delegates woke up the next morning knowing they still had some serious work to do. The Constitution needed to be formally approved, copied, and distributed to the states for ratification. The real political battle was just beginning. But the shared experience of this epic celebration probably helped the delegates maintain their unity during the difficult ratification process. When anti-federalists attacked the Constitution as an elite conspiracy, the Federalists could draw on the bonds that they formed over drinks at City Tavern. The $17,000 bar tab also became part of the Constitution's mythology. Stories about the Founding Fathers' legendary drinking helped humanize them and make their political achievements seem more accessible to ordinary Americans. The idea that the Constitution was born partly at a tavern made it seem like a more democratic, less elitist document. Looking back, the City Tavern celebration represents both the best and worst of 18th century political culture. On the positive side, it shows how alcohol could facilitate political compromise, encourage honest discussion, and build the relationships that made democratic government possible. The delegates' ability to drink together, despite their political differences, demonstrated a level of civility and mutual respect that seems, admirable today. On the negative side, the enormous expense and exclusive nature of the celebration highlighted the economic and social divisions that would continue to challenge American democracy. The men who could afford to spend $17,000 on drinks were not representative of the broader American population, and their perspective on governance inevitably reflected their privileged position. The story of the Constitutional Convention bar tab reminds us that American democracy was built not just through high-minded political theory, but through very human processes of negotiation, compromise, and relationship building. Sometimes these processes involved heated debates in formal meeting rooms, and sometimes they involved drinking contests in taverns. The Founding Fathers weren't just marble statues. They were flesh-and-blood politicians who used every tool available to them, including alcohol, to achieve their political goals. The Constitution that emerged from their work was shaped not just by abstract principles, but by the practical realities of how human beings actually interact and make decisions. Today, when we face our own constitutional challenges and political divisions, we might learn something from the Founding Fathers' ability to combine principled disagreement with personal civility. They fought fiercely over ideas during the day, but they could still share drinks and stories at night. The $17,000 bar tab is ultimately a reminder that democracy is a very human enterprise, with all the messiness, complexity, and occasional excess that implies. The Constitution wasn't handed down from high. It was hammered out by imperfect people who sometimes needed liquid courage to do their best work. So the next time you raise a glass, remember the 55 delegates who celebrated the completion of the Constitution with enough alcohol to stock a small liquor store. They may have had legendary hangovers the next morning, but they also created a document that has guided American democracy for over 230 years. Not bad for a night's work.